Good evening. I would like to welcome you to a new semester, and a new semester, of course, would not be really a good semester without the Krasno event series. And here we are again. We have actually 8 events with in total 18 speakers, so it's a very full program. And you see some of the lectures on the screen right now. The next one will be by a Japanese diplomat in 2 weeks' time, talking about Japan and China. Then we will have an event about Russia and Putin's policies, which, as you know, get increasingly interesting, almost more interesting by the day. Then we have an ambassadors roundtable about the Middle East. And the problem with Iran, of course, will feature large here. We have also another. Then we have Admiral Dennis Blair, who used to be the country's top intelligence officer, who will talk about will the United States remain a Pacific power, and what will it be like as a Pacific power. Then we have a transatlantic roundtable on the problems between America and Europe, particularly NATO and European integration. Then we have also another roundtable or 2 talks on the competition, the economic competition between Germany and China, and actually China and Europe's desperate attempt to remain relevant between the United States and China. And eventually, on April the 21st, toward the end of the semester, we have a roundtable on the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a not unimportant event either, and I think we have to commemorate that, and we have an interesting roundtable with a number of very distinguished professors. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Cruster Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before we start, I would like to remind you that we have a YouTube channel. All our talks will be on our YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/KresnoUNC. Please watch it, as I always say, please watch it daily if possible. Then we have a website where the program is listed, and also all our forthcoming talks are listed. That's krasnoevents.com. And we also, as you will know by now, we have an extensive mailing list. So please make sure you can get onto our mailing list. I would also like to mention my 6, or in the meantime 7, Krasno assistants. Without them, the whole thing wouldn't work at all. So it's great to have them here. We have 2 very experienced cameramen and many other assistants. So without them, we wouldn't all be here. So thank you very much for doing that. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Professor Nancy MacLean from Duke University, just down the road, if you have forgotten. She's a William Chafe Distinguished Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke. She is focused in her work largely on 20th century America. She has written a terrible lot of articles and essays and also books. It's very difficult to keep up, I must say. And she has also been awarded multiple prizes and awards for her work. She has written in all the leading magazines and newspapers, and of course in scholarly journals. And it is great that you were able to make it tonight. She has written 4 previous books, including a book on the American workplace and a book on the Ku Klux Klan, the Second Ku Klux Klan, I understand. And her new book, her latest book, is entitled Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. And that is a book, and that is a topic she will talk to us tonight. And as always, we will have a panel discussion after Nancy has talked to us for 35-40 minutes. And toward the end of the evening, of course, we have our exciting Q&A session. And I hope again that many of you will ask multiple questions, and Nancy will be more than happy to answer them. And do not forget, Nancy's book is available outside. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Nancy MacLean to UNC tonight.
Good afternoon. I see I'm going to get some technical assistance. Well, I've always thought that the rivalry between Duke and UNC was vastly overplayed. And in fact, the 2 institutions are so important as collaborators, particularly with graduate education and faculty research, but even sometimes with undergrads, which is wonderful. The place we could use some diplomacy, I think, is the parking situation. I actually told them I was the speaker tonight, and they said, too bad, it's a basketball game. You have to leave. Okay. Anyway, I would like to thank Professor Lares for inviting me to be part of this exciting series that you have developed here. The topics are just really so impressive, and the variety of speakers coming in, and it's delightful to be here as a historian. I wish that the topic that I will be speaking about were not an international and transnational topic now, but unfortunately it is, as I'll come back to at the very tail end of my remarks. But I'm also very grateful to this series, because the first time I met Klaus was when Colonel Larry Wilkerson was visiting. I guess was that last year or 2 years ago or something. But so I met Klaus at a lunch with between himself and Larry and me, and Larry has since become a fast friend and just an incredible source of wisdom and co-counsel. We feel like we have two halves of the same walnut that we're struggling with. So anyway, it's been a really nice relationship. I wish I could keep going in this vein, but I have to take a bit of a turn here, because I don't think I have to persuade anyone in this room that American politics are in crisis. Pretty deep crisis, and hurtling downwards as we meet. And sadly, given the dominance of the United States in the world system, anything that happens here ramifies elsewhere. So what's going on here now will have consequences for peoples around the world. I think you know this. I think that's why you all attend this fascinating series at Krasno. But what you might be struggling to figure out is how we reached this nadir that we have in the United States right now, and what that means. And of course, this watershed has been fed by many streams, and historians, political scientists, journalists have written much about them over the years. They include the kind of movement conservatism that made Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate for president in 1964, just after his vote against the Civil Rights Act of that year. Another and related stream is the religious right that has grown so powerful since the 1970s. And then sadly, there is the white supremacist right, which has resurged with a vengeance in the last several years. All of these are important, and along with others, they have yielded the votes to effect radical policy change. But this evening, I want to talk to you about another piece of how we got into the dangerous situation in which we now find ourselves. And this is a missing piece that explains much that otherwise remains mysterious. I'm referring in particular to the ideas that are guiding the billionaire-funded radical right made famous or notorious by Charles Koch, depending on your perspective. I believe that knowing these ideas and understanding how the Koch network's operations have weaponized them is important not only in its own right to see more clearly what is happening and why and how, but I think it's also important to the future of our country, quite frankly, and to democracy in America. A public health nurse who read my book, Democracy in Chains, put it this way. She said, "We need to get the diagnosis right before we can determine the best treatment plan." And I think that's a really helpful analogy for our situation. Why does this matter so much? Because right now, there is an unmarked hazard in our situation in the United States. And that is that the noisiest threats to democracy are getting the most attention. Among them, sadly, those coming from the White House. But as our current president, a figure I've come to think about in many ways as the distractor in chief, and I'll explain that as we go along, and his daily conduct draws nearly all media attention, an even more extreme plan is in fact moving along apace. It is moving along in the 30 states now dominated by this cause, including our own North Carolina. It is moving along in federal departments and agencies, and it is moving along in the courts. This plan that I'll be talking about is being pursued by a much smaller cause, a much less popular cause, in fact, but one that is archly determined and breathtakingly well-funded. And this cause's architects aim to rewrite the rules of our society permanently. To do so, they have shown that they are willing, in fact determined, to use those other sections of the right that I mentioned, particularly the religious right, but also the racially motivated right, to get what they want in the knowledge that otherwise they could not achieve it because their own ideas are not popular. I'll state my case simply, and that is that behind all the seeming chaos and dysfunction in our public life right now, there's a strategy in play, a cold-eyed, calculated strategy. And that strategy is far along. One of its field generals said this in late 2015, and I quote, "We're close to winning. They don't have the real path." That was Mark Holden, the head of Koch Industries' Government and Public Affairs operation, speaking to an invitation-only audience of millionaire and multimillionaire and billionaire donors. Now, I'm sure, especially being in North Carolina, that you've heard a great deal over the last decade now about the fortune that Charles Koch has been investing to change our politics in this country. But what you've probably not heard about is the ideas, the technology, as Koch refers to them, that have lately made those ideas so devastatingly effective. It was an academic economist, I learned, who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism of the variety they want to see thrive, democracy must be enchained, not overthrown, as in a coup, but rather slowly, carefully, deliberately rigged so that it can no longer provide what citizens have looked to it to provide for generations now. From quality public education, to retirement security, to environmental protection, and more. So my research provides a backstory of this defining moment in which we find ourselves, as it also explains that real path to which Mark Holden referred. In its essence, the book is a story of two men, a thinker and a CEO, whose lives converged in the 1970s and thereafter through a shared commitment to transform the model of government that our country had built up over the course of the 20th century. The thinker was a Tennessee-born economist, a man named James McGill Buchanan, who spent most of his career in Virginia public institutions of higher education, and the CEO is, of course, Charles Koch, who spent most of his adult life, when he wasn't making Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, trying to find strategy to make our country and the wider world, in fact, conform to a vision of arch economic liberty, a kind of free-rein capitalism beyond the reach of voters and our governments. The history my book conveys is first of the crucible in which James Buchanan came up with this idea of enchaining democracy, and those are his words, by the way, to insulate economic liberty. And that was as the civil rights movement made headway in Virginia, his adopted state, and in the nation in the late 1950s and 60s. Then the focus of the book turns to how Charles Koch began funding an apparatus to make that idea a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the volatile situation we are now confronting. So that's where I'm going with this. But what I'd like to do this evening, rather than retell the book's story or make this case in the abstract, is instead tell you the research story of how I stumbled on the trail that led me ultimately to these findings. Because I believe that knowing the route that led me to the stark conclusions I've just shared will in fact give you an even sharper sense of the stakes of all of this. For one thing, because it turns out that what we are seeing now in America in the last several years is not the first time that the libertarian right has shown itself willing to explore exploit white supremacy to advance a cause that I have come to think about as property supremacy. A property supremacy that will have its most devastating impact on lower income people, particularly black and brown people who were long denied full citizenship, but that will ultimately affect us all and through our planet have potentially, frankly, catastrophic effects. So what led me to these conclusions? In a word, serendipity. When I began the research that became this book in 2006, I had never heard of the two people I just mentioned, James Buchanan or Charles Koch. I didn't go looking for them. You could say they found me in the archives. I'm a historian of social movements in the US and their impact on politics. I've had a particular interest throughout the years in the US South. And in 2006, I had just finished another book when I came across the tragic tale of Prince Edward County, Virginia. And this was a county in Southside Virginia, the old plantation, tobacco plantation belt, whose white officials answered the U.S. Supreme Court's call to desegregate their public schools without further delay by, as these white county officials put it, and I quote, going out of the public school business entirely. They shuttered every public school in the county. They padlocked them. They put no trespassing signs up, and they left black children with no formal education whatsoever for 5 years as their white counterparts were sent off to a private segregation academy with purloined public resources. And they kept those public schools shut for 5 years until the courts compelled them to reinstate a public school system. This is the story I set out to explore. Shocked that I hadn't encountered it before as someone who studies civil rights and had a deep interest in the South, I began to dig in. And I learned in short order that tax-funded school vouchers were crucial to this effort in Prince Edward County and to the wider project of massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education by diehard segregationists across the South, but led by Virginia. I also discovered before long that the Chicago Libertarian economist, Milton Friedman, anybody familiar with his book Capitalism and Freedom or his columns or other things over the years, I learned that Milton Friedman had issued his first manifesto calling for such vouchers, in his terms, to undermine the government monopoly of education in 1955. The year after the Brown decision was issued, and in full advance knowledge of how that call would be used by segregationists in the South. So Friedman became part of my story, and I thought, this is interesting. We've heard a lot about what some people call neoliberalism, some people call free market fundamentalism. Choose your descriptor, but what we never had heard was this deeper story of how it first began to take hold in policy terms in the South, particularly in the early 1960s, until the court later ruled these vouchers an intentional form of continuing discrimination. So I started building Friedman into my story. But in following a footnote, I learned of a 1959 report as this threat from Prince Edward County was in the air to close the schools that fall by two other economists, both of whom had been trained at University of Chicago and worked with Friedman, in fact. And one of them was this James McGill Buchanan. They had just set up in 1956 a new center for essentially to promote this kind of free market thinking at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And this report that they issued in '59 attempted to refute a movement of moderate whites, led by mothers particularly, and liberal clergy, who were trying to save Virginia's public school system from the segregationist threat of this parallel private system. How did these economists fight? They made the case that if the state sold off its facilities to private operators, it could provide better education with liberty. In this case, the most relevant liberty would be liberty from the federal courts. The report they issued, in effect, called for privatizing the South's public schools before that verb existed. They saw the crisis as an opportunity to get rid of public education because it was public and because they were libertarian ideologues. And they did so in the full knowledge that the schools that would be funded by such what we would call vouchers today, they were called tuition grants then, that these would be white segregation academies, because those were the only private schools in question at the time. And black parents and their organizations opposed these vouchers to a person, considering it a violation of the equal constitutional dignity that had been recognized with the Brown case. The timing of their report was also telling. The two wrote just as the massive resistance state legislators were trying to pass a measure to alter the Constitution of Virginia so that it would no longer guarantee a public education. Now, needless to say, it stunned me as a professor myself to see two scholars making a case for what their state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it intrigued me that they did so not in racial terms, but in economic terms, quite self-consciously leveraging the authority of their discipline and Buchanan's position as the new chair of the economics department in Thomas Jefferson's University, Mr. Jefferson's University, as they call it in Virginia, using that authority to back up the state's powerful right-wing elite. Buchanan and Nutter knew that they were exploiting the rage of segregationists to move their libertarian agenda. Their cover letter to legislators with their report said that they were speaking out, and I quote, letting the chips fall where they may. That's actually the title of one of my chapters, because it was perfectly obvious to anyone at the time where those chips would fall. So they were aware, in other words, of the harm that their actions would inflict. And as an educator myself, I wondered, frankly, how anyone could do such a thing. Not in an irrational frenzy, but in cold-eyed calculation. So I began to dig in further to seek more information about this James Buchanan. I learned then that he had gone on to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. He was awarded the prize for having pioneered a new way of thinking called public choice economics, which I learned also became influential in political science and law and among activists and elected officials, in fact, on the political right. What Buchanan did, in his phrase that was new, was the economic analysis of politics. That's how he described it. But it was a very distinctive economic analysis. He argued that public actors should only be understood as individuals rationally seeking their own personal self-interest. You could even say their own selfish interest, not the common good, as they claimed. So this was a kind of debunking effort from the start. And it led Buchanan to some interesting findings about deficits and other things we could talk about in the discussion. But it also led him to give scientific imprimatur to a long-standing belief on the political right in the South in particular, going all the way back to Reconstruction, in fact, saying that politicians were essentially buying the votes of citizens with programs, and that these citizens who were going to government for things that they couldn't get from the market on their own as individuals were, he said, repurposing a term from economics, rent seekers. They were trying to get these special benefits from the political process that they couldn't get from the economy. And he portrayed this as illegitimate collectivism. Now, as a speaker who identified, hello everyone, sorry about the seating situation, as a speaker who specialized in public finance, in government revenues, taxation, etc., and who identified with the political right in the South and nationally, Buchanan made it his mission to find ways to lower taxes and shrink the expanding public sector. And here I think it helps to go back and remember that moment of the late 1950s and early 1960s. This was the post-war era when the government was doing things like funding public universities, funding basic science, funding a highway system, all of these other things that libertarians did not believe were legitimate for government to be doing. So with this public choice economics, Buchanan turned new attention to what he liked to call the rules of the game of politics, to the taxing and spending incentives of that process, and ultimately to how altering the rules of the process might yield different outcomes. I want to be clear that those ideas have since been seen as useful to think with by other people who are not on the political right, but I also found through my research that Buchanan's version of these, what he and his colleagues called the Virginia School of Political Economy, to distinguish it from the Chicago School, was always distinctive. Buchanan said himself, looking back from a documentary made in 2007, that when he set to work in the late 1950s, the idea of the public interest was dominant, this idea of the common good. And he said, looking back, that's what I wanted to tear down, this idea of the public interest. Why, I thought, would anyone want to do that? It is so fundamental to the functioning of a healthy democracy that we have some sense that we arrive at a majoritarian view of the common good and the public interest. So I was perplexed, but I kept reading, and through that I learned that to a libertarian like Buchanan, there is no common good. Any such notion of shared purpose, he and his colleagues believed, would lead government to coerce those who didn't agree with the majority. And the minority he was consistently concerned with was the minority of wealthy taxpayers and corporations who didn't share the majority's view of the public interest. Buchanan and his colleagues argued that government all but steals the property of this unwilling minority if it taxes them for purposes they don't share. So he was quite at pains to insist that we are not our brother's keepers. Or at least we should not be able to use government to shift tax revenues from one citizen to another. And he came to talk about all of this in very stark and foreboding terms that are now widespread on the right. You can hear them almost any day on talk radio in crude forms. A case in point. How many remember when candidate Mitt Romney in 2012 spoke disdainfully at a private donor dinner of those he called the 47% who were too dependent on government to ever consider voting for him? People remember that? Good, okay. So lots of pundits thought that this cost Romney the election, this notion that millions of his fellow citizens were just, sort of hiving off the public trough. But it turns out that Romney wasn't offering a new idea here or anything he'd personally come up with. By then, the Heritage Foundation, assisted by James Buchanan, funded by Charles Koch and others, was maintaining what they call the annual index of dependency derived from public choice economics to try to gauge how dependent their fellow citizens were. It was Buchanan who gave scholarly imprimatur to this kind of thinking, and he did not hold back. Even in his scholarly work, he spoke of net tax recipients, those who get more from government than they are paying in. And of course, all of us will be at that position some point in our lives, if we're disabled, if we're elderly, if we're parents, if we're children, etc. Well, he spoke of those people as parasites on the productive. And he warned of predators and prey. The predators being people like, we could say, the teachers of North Carolina who in that red state protest tried to get more monies for public education at all levels, environmentalists, cleaning up brownfields. All of these people are the predators. The prey were those wealthy taxpayers who didn't want to support these efforts and would unwillingly have to support them. So this vocabulary, I have to say, from my earlier research, which made me sensitive to these things, that kind of vocabulary made millions of his fellow citizens look like menaces, not even fully human. It is a vocabulary that is disinhibiting, one that licenses hostility. I mean, think about it, parasites, predators, prey, etc. And again, it is a language that is rife on the political right today. As I read more, I also learned that for those who think this way, Justice is a very simple matter. I keep what I earn, you keep what you earn. And you, collectively, can only legitimately tax me if I agree with all your goals and purposes. And in fact, Buchanan's colleague at George Mason has argued precisely this on the campaign trail. I believe he's the only he's been referred to even within the Koch enterprise as the only African-American scholar who is a pro-Confederate. But leave that for another day. But since that's such an issue in both our campuses, it's worth mentioning. In any event, Buchanan himself did not stop with these assertions. In the 1970s, he moved from scholarship to organizing. He began urging donors on the political right to help build what he called a counterintelligentsia. He said the way to do it was to create, and these are his words, a gravy train. A gravy train to bring men into the libertarian fold and train them for intellectual and political battle. As he organized, he also shifted from diagnosis, from identifying what he thought was wrong, to prescription, to saying what he thought should happen. And since he believed that by this measure of protecting that unwilling tax-paying and regulated minority from their fellow citizens, all existing constitutions in the world were failures by that metric, he set out to design a new constitutional regime that could, as one of his colleagues said, protect capitalism from government, that could enshrine the rights of the wealthy minority to a degree no society anywhere had ever done. He turned to this project of designing a new constitutional regime at a particularly propitious moment. This was in the mid-1970s when the brutal military junta of General Augusto Pinochet in Chile was facing intense international pressure to return to representative government. But they wanted to lock in the radical transformation of Chile's political economy they had forced on the citizenry while the people had no power, including the privatization of education and Social Security. So in 1980, the dictatorship invited Buchanan to Santiago to try out his ideas for how to devise a constitution that would protect capitalism from government. The result, the so-called Constitution of Liberty, is still in effect today in Chile. In fact, the Constitution, if you've been watching the news recently, is the reason that dozens of people have died in protests, and many have been blinded, and thousands affected and arrested. What is it about this Constitution? It's this. It is, as Michelle Bachelet, a president who was elected in 2013 on a wide-ranging reform platform, put it, a constitution of locks and bolts. That's actually the title of my chapter on this Chilean interlude. She was elected on this reform program after huge protests of students in the streets because Chilean public education had become the most costly in the developed world. They had the sympathy of adults who were facing old age poverty because of the way that the Social Security system had been privatized, tremendous inequality. She comes in on a reform platform in 2013 and realizes she can't deliver. Her hands are bound by this Constitution of Liberty. She told someone, I can't get my hands around the economy. But that was precisely the point of the Constitution that Buchanan advised on. And sadly, I'm not telling you here in the US this Chilean story for purely historical reasons. I'm telling you this story because that kind of a constitution of locks and bolts, is coming to the United States, owing to pressure from the Koch network, which is determined to achieve the kinds of binding legal and constitutional changes Buchanan urged without informing the public of their true goals. And thanks to assiduous organizing by the apparatus that the Koch donor network funds, above all the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and a Republican Party that the donors have all but taken over and turned into a delivery vehicle with the threat of well-funded primary challenges. This cause now has in place 28 of the 34 states needed authorizations needed to call the first constitutional convention in our history since that of 1787 that crafted the Constitution. It is an incredibly radical and reckless gambit. Common Cause, the civic group, calls it the most serious threat to democracy, flying almost completely under the radar. And it's possible that it could be a few years away at the rate things are going. And it's not getting anything like the coverage that it needs. So, you may be wondering how I was able to put together the way that Buchanan's ideas were guiding this real path that the Koch network is following to shackle democracy ultimately by changing the Constitution. The answer is, again, in good part, serendipity. I moved from Chicago to North Carolina in 2010, just as a radicalized Republican Party dominated by Koch-backed Tea Party figures, won majorities in both houses of the General Assembly. And suddenly the things I was reading about in Buchanan's work that still seemed so abstract became very concrete as the General Assembly's top donor, Art Pope, featured here, boasted of the big bang his grantees were delivering to make this once moderate state a laboratory for the cause, using measures derived from public choice thought. So what did I see happening here in this shock and awe style big bang that began in 2011? By the way, I'd also gone to grad school at the University of Wisconsin where Scott Walker was doing the same thing there, kind of thing there at the same time. To get what happened here and to understand in a way that isn't just playing whack-a-mole what happened, it's important to know that Buchanan had long urged his teammates that he said, if you don't like public policy over a long period of time, stop focusing on who rules and start thinking about the rules and how you can change them to get the results that you want. And that is essentially what we saw happen in North Carolina. What unfolded here was a stunning barrage of radical rules changes on just this model, one after another. I don't have to tell many of you here, it's still a painful topic. Among them, extreme gerrymandering to misrepresent the electorate, new measures to undermine workers' ability to come together in unions, particularly teachers' unions, attacks on public education at all levels and radical cuts in funding for it, refusal to accept the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act despite a crying need for health care in our low-wage state, and rolling back measures to protect the environment and reduce global warming, among others. And then to cap all this off, they passed, when they also got the governorship in 2012, what Democracy North Carolina came to call the Monster Voter Suppression Bill. What proved so surreal to me as a scholar and a citizen was that I could see that this new majority was applying James Buchanan-style ideas to get what they otherwise could not, certainly not if they had campaigned openly on the kinds of things that they were rushing through. But I could also see how the wonderful critics of all of this, including the people who had made North Carolina such a beacon to the South over the years, were having trouble grasping the deep operational strategy that unified these various measures. People kept trying to argue with the legislators in terms of how many lives would be lost, how many children's educations would be ruined, all of these things which in other times would have been persuasive, but they were not. Because the people who were pushing this through believed that their end game was worth that price. They were, again, you could say, in cold calculation, letting the chips fall where they may. What my fellow critics of all this also could not see was that this agenda was backed by an ethical system we need to understand to know what's happening to our state and nation. I understand why that's hard to grasp, even for deep religious figures, brilliant thinkers like Reverend Barber, who was recently awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant, because it's an ethical system that is at odds with the best of every major religious tradition in the world. But we need to understand it. Case in point, the libertarian morality deems it better to have people die from lack of health care than to receive it from government, from taxes paid for by others. And ultimately, that is what they mean by personal responsibility. They mean that you should be on your own for all of your needs, and you will be on your own if they succeed in bringing this new world into being. Parents will be paying private schools for their children's education. People will be saving for their own Social Security retirement and on insurance. We could go on, and all of that would be invested where? With unregulated Wall Street firms. What they seek, in short, is a world in which we are kept from using government to help ourselves and one another by ironclad new rules. I learned all this and more in 2013 when James Buchanan died, and finally that September I was able to gain access to his private archive at George Mason University, his last institutional home. And there, in his records going back to the late 1940s, I found my developing understanding of all of this confirmed. And I have to say confirmed in a way that sometimes left me reminding myself to breathe. I'll give you an example. In his private office on the second floor, I found stacked on a chair a pile of documents that exposed how Charles Koch and several of his most trusted operatives, George Mason University economics faculty, the law school dean, the president and the provost, and a politically appointed board of visitors had collaborated to establish a base camp for this highly political project at a public university just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. That was in 1997 when Charles Koch gave his first $10 million gift to George Mason to support a big new center for political economy. And Koch made it clear in the speech that accompanied this money that he wanted to see bold steps. He said he wanted to unleash the kind of force that propelled Columbus to his discoveries. The operatives that he put in place at George Mason and beyond would ensure that that happened. One of them was Buchanan's former colleague, Richie Fink, who by that point had become Charles Koch's chief political strategist. And Fink made it clear that barging into the nation's higher education system, by any means necessary, was crucial because, as he told the donors, it's an integrated strategy that uses universities, think tanks, and political spending for the implementation of policy change. What kind of strategy? A stealth strategy, because the chief funder and architect, Charles Koch, knew the majority would reject the goals this cause seeks if people were told the honest truth about where this was heading. And they knew this from historical experience that we can talk about afterwards. And here's Koch saying as much. To make the remainder of this story short, we have all felt that force that he wanted to unleash since. And just as it did not start with President Obama's election, so it will not stop with the end of the current administration, however that happens. In closing, let me pull back the lens from this flagship public university campus, George Mason, to the overall Koch project of social and political transformation. As I came to study this project, particularly in light of what I found in Buchanan House Archives, as it's called, I found myself literally astounded by the scope and audacity of this project. The Koch effort to transform our country now encompasses dozens of ostensibly separate national organizations, some of them featured here. You may know some of the others, including the Federalist Society, recently in the news with the Supreme Court. It also includes state-level operations that make up something called the State Policy Network. Art Pope funds several in North Carolina. So we're talking about, in the U.S. alone, hundreds of organizations that are working to radically alter government and society, to bring this kind of unfettered, free-rein capitalism into being without being honest with the people. And here's another thing, particularly important, I think, for an audience such as this, which is very globally aware. This is no longer just a U.S. effort. there is, oh, sorry, these are the agendas. We can come back to those perhaps. But there is now something called the Atlas Network, which is a transnational network of operations operating in over 90 countries with some 484 affiliates, many of them funded by this US-based Koch donor network as their core base of support. Finally, as a historian of the United States South, I came to realize something else. And that was that the form of government these men see as liberty, as the ideal free society, that would actually look a lot like Virginia over the first 2/3 of the 20th century, in all but the state-forced racial segregation we tend to focus on in hindsight. When James Buchanan set to work in Charlottesville in 1956 with an avowed mission to preserve liberty, that state had just been identified by the great political scientist V.O. Key as the most oligarchical state in the South and therefore in the nation. V.O. Key had a sort of biting sense of humor, and he really wanted to get across the point of how oligarchical Virginia was. So he said, next to Virginia, Mississippi is a hotbed of democracy. He was writing in 1949. Think about it yourselves. In light of what I've said here tonight, in light of what you have witnessed in this state and in the nation at large over the last decade, what is the substance of Buchanan and Koch's notion of liberty, but mid-century Virginia, a state that still had formally representative government, had a state house, had courts, had institutions, but was in fact subjected to the most thorough control by an oligarchy? As I said, the state-mandated racial oppression would go, but we need to recognize that nearly everything else about the political economy of mid-century Virginia enacts the libertarian rights stream. And here I think I'll go back to this slide, which seems apropos. Just a few examples. The use of right-to-work laws and other ploys to keep working people powerless, the suspicion of public education as a source of subversion, the regressive tax system and use of a pay-as-you-go rule to prevent forward-looking public investments for future generations, the insistence that government should not be allowed to stop discrimination or provide for public health in deference to the property rights of businesses and of unwilling taxpayers, the deployment of states' rights legal arguments to prevent the federal government from promoting equal treatment, the opposition to social insurance, such as Social Security and Medicare, which was led by Harry Byrd in the U.S. Senate and by Virginia's Howard Smith in the House, and, of course, voting rights restrictions to keep those unlikely to support this system away from participation at the polls. And one more thing, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering that scholars have since determined would have prevented, if the gerrymandering had not existed and cities and suburbs in Virginia had been properly represented, that massive resistance legislation that authorized the vouchers never would have passed. In short, what Virginia had then and what the radical right seeks now is a system of rigged rules that in combination will ensure the uncontested sway of corporations and the wealthiest and most arch-right citizens. They seek, in a phrase, to put democracy in chains. And the question this stealth project presents us with, once we know it, I believe, is at one level really quite simple. Is the kind of world that this cause seeks to bring into being the kind of world that you want to live in, or bring up children or grandchildren in? That is the real public choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy MacLean. That was most interesting and invigorating. And I think that gives us plenty of food for thought and questions. What is the radical right? How would you define the radical right?
Yeah, thank you for that. And it could be defined in different ways, but where I'm talking about it, I'm really talking about this radical libertarian right funded by the Koch donor network. And I think it's important because I think many good Republicans, longtime Republican voters, are struggling to understand what happened to their party. My father voted for the Republican Party for most of his life. He was a very good man, a kind of Eisenhower Republican. And I think if he were alive now, he would just be gobsmacked at what we're seeing. And I don't think that we can understand what has happened to one of our major parties, which is now marching with Lenin-like discipline. We can't understand that unless we understand the pincers action that this donor network and the allied organizations with which it works have created. To wit, through groups like Freedom Partners, Chamber of Commerce, Donors Trust, these big donor collaboratives that have dark money, they are able to threaten any Republican candidate with a primary challenge if they don't toe the donors' line. And they have mobilized the base sufficiently with disinformation from Fox News, with rallying by the religious right organizations that the Koch network also supports, to feel like they are being served somehow by this operation, when in fact they are not. So it is really quite frightening, and I think, I'm not alone in saying this part. There are many political scientists now writing books with titles like How Democracies Die. So we have a really serious problem on our hands, and I think to understand that, we need to really think about these investors who are far to the right of ordinary Republican voters who are driving the action in the way that leaves many ordinary people just mystified.
Thank you. Let me play devil's advocate and ask you, isn't that all a conspiracy theory? Isn't really anyone, be it a rich man like Koch or other rich billionaires, are they really capable of organizing something like that domestically and internationally and also get away with it without a counter movement stopping them?
Well, I think there are counter movements, but the counter movements are not nearly as strategic and integrated as what's going on in the political right. No, I don't believe this is a conspiracy. It's actually worse than a conspiracy in many ways, but we don't yet have even a concept in the social sciences for what is going on, because we have never seen inequality in a modern society grow to the levels that we have, so that we have this billionaire class that is utterly cut off from their fellow citizens, have come to think of us as, again, parasites and predators, and become determined to change the system. It's not a conspiracy because they are so wealthy, they can hire the best legal talent to stay on the bright side of the law. And in fact, I think they delight in pushing everything to the limits, but staying, except with donor law. I think they're very vulnerable in 501c3 stuff, which is why they jumped on the IRS when it began to look into these, but I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But and it is no longer just one man, but I think, Charles Koch is a very smart man. Again, anybody who has studied this comes to related conclusions. There's a very good book by a business reporter who used to work for the Wall Street Journal, Christopher Leonard, that just came out, called Kochland, which is about Koch Industries and its business model. Koch is a genius at setting other people's self-interest to work so that it can be harnessed to his goals, whether it's making this company, one of the largest privately held companies in the world. And he and his brother, by the way, what did I read? That between the two of them, if you had combined their fortunes, they would have been the richest man in the world, Charles and David. So we're talking about huge amounts of money. But so no, it's not a conspiracy. It is a very integrated, strategic, smart, long game that activates the self-interest of lots of different players in ways that get people to move the ball forward for this cause. For example, I don't really know how much Republican leaders know about the kind of story I'm telling here, but what they have understood from these donors is that they have the chance of a permanent political power as what has become a real minority party. By suppressing the vote, by gerrymandering, by doing all these things, they can stay in power, they can keep their jobs. We could go on, but it's really smart. I don't think almost anybody on the left has understood how smart the other side is and how this works. And there are, thousands, tens of thousands of people now who are some part in this project, but they don't all have to know the ultimate end game, and it's probably more convenient if they don't.
Thank you. If there are so many think tanks, institutions, organizations which follow Charles Koch and his crowd, is that largely for the money, or is it also for the ideology which is behind it?
Yeah, well, I think he is deeply serious about his ideology. I mean, no one would do what this man has done over the years if he did not take these ideas really seriously. And I talk about it in the book. I mean, he was funding these little seminars of Austrian economists, in the 1970s that maybe drew 12 or 15 people to get this ball rolling, right? So he is really serious about it. And I've met people who have met him who said he deeply believes this stuff. I believe it. I don't think he would do this if he didn't. At the same time, I have also come to realize more strongly with Koch himself how inseparable his commitment to this libertarian ideology is from his interests as a fossil fuel corporation owner. And climate science, stopping action on the environment and on climate change in particular is absolutely fundamental to this enterprise. And he has been at that personally since the early 1990s. The Koch network now has spent, Koch foundations are spending more than fossil fuel corporations to deny climate change and to defame climate change scientists, which makes it astonishing that, sorry, but your institution and mine are accepting Charles Koch Foundation monies into their universities. But that's a story for another day. But so that's, and that's Charles Koch. I think most of these people believe some element, of this, and then there's also lots of monetary advantage that comes with, so I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and. But I will also say what I think is important, if you reduce these libertarian ideas to kind of their core essentials and look at them in history and who they've appealed to, this is really a return to social Darwinism, right? Those ideas of the 19th century, late 19th century, in the age of the robber barons, who said that if you're not making it, that's on you, right? This is kind of a perfect system to them, except where government gets involved. So if people are poor, especially if they have intergenerational poverty, well, that's because there's something wrong with them, right? They used to say biology, now they'll say culture, but it is very deeply social Darwinist. And so for a lot of people, this mobilizes, as it did in the South in that period, ideas about racial superiority and inferiority. I mean, I actually think about this now as a kind of economic eugenics program. Our state experienced racial eugenics in the early 20th century, but this really is about saying, if you have profited, if you're doing well in this society, great, good for you, let's make you more profitable. If you're not, parasites, predators, I think ultimately, I really do, honestly, I've spoken at many div schools, faith congregations, etc. I think this is about ultimately trying to transform our ethical system in a quite radical way.
Thank you. Let me just hasten to say that the Krasno Event Series hasn't received any Koch money. And we haven't accepted any others. Did you try to interview him?
No, I didn't want to alert this network to the research that I was doing. If you look me up, you'll see that they have attacked me quite vigorously since the book came out. So
before you published the book, didn't you try to naively, innocently interview him?
No, because as soon as I saw where this was going, I thought, and also you have to understand how dirty these folks play. The New Yorker journalist Jane Mayer, who was the first to expose the Koch network in a series of articles in 2011, then she wrote the very important and revelatory book Dark Money. They came after her in a big way. They hired a private investigator to try to dig up dirt on her. They tried to get her fired by accusing her falsely and ridiculously of plagiarism. So I knew these guys were going to come after me. There was no question. It was a question of how, when, with what force. But I absolutely.
How did that? Tell us.
Well, you can. If you look me up on the internet, you will see all kinds of attacks from them and they're very much in the nature of climate science denial, right? They try to create an appearance of controversy, an appearance of scholarship, when their arguments are utterly unpersuasive to anybody who knows the Virginia history, for example, what they've tried to do to, exculpate Buchanan from what he did in Virginia. But they create enough smog that people think it's controversial and they don't have to pay attention to it. Now, fortunately, people could also see where they were coming from pretty quickly, and a lot of people connected the dots for themselves. So I got people writing to me saying, I'd never heard of you or your book, but I saw these attacks and they were so crazy. I got your book and wow, I love it when you come speak. But so it was that kind of thing. But I also made all kinds of wonderful new friends from this research. And one example is a young Greenpeace researcher who works with a great group called Uncoke My Campus. They have a fabulous website. Go to it, look it up, chock full of good resources. But this Greenpeace researcher was watching these attacks on my book, and he had read it. He knew what it actually said. And he saw that what they were doing was like climate science denial. It was the exact same MO. So he started a media tracker and followed the Koch IRS forms to see who they're giving money to and everything. Anyway, he found out that he did this tracker that shows 92 out of, I think it was 100 when he stopped about a year and a half ago, 92 out of 100 of the attacks on me came from Koch-funded faculty members or Koch operatives who didn't declare their conflicts of interest and their loyalty to this cause while they were putting out these specious and spurious attacks. So it's a pretty well integrated operation, and that's why the academic wing is so important too, because they try to get students. They call it the talent pipeline. They want to bring students in, and then they use the students to go work for the state policy network groups and the think tanks and staff all the apparatus, and the faculty that they have then advise the state policy network and the national groups, and they run defense. And I've seen this described in their own centers against anybody who criticizes the cause. Because it looks really impressive if you have so-and-so chair of the economics department at George Mason University with a distinguished chair name saying that somebody is wrong or they've made things up or whatever. So no, it's something that I don't think our society is prepared for. I know our higher education administrators are not prepared for this. The Chronicle of Higher Education has given some coverage to it. The American Association of University Professors is paying attention and has done really good work, so I encourage faculty here to join that. But look what's happening in our society, the levels of systematic strategic disinformation. If we took the Koch money out of that equation, we'd be having very different public conversations.
What is the link to the current administration? Trump and Koch are not really personal friends, are they?
No, I think Charles Koch would think that Donald Trump was quite vulgar. I don't think he'd ever invite him to dinner. He described him as a monster at one point in 2016. Although
this is surprising, isn't it?
But then when some other people said, oh, the Kochs are supporting Hillary Clinton, he called that a blood libel, a kind of a creepy phrase if you know its history. Anyway, so the Koch network had actually invested in all the rest of the Republican presumable front runners. So they had relationships with Jeb Bush, with Marco Rubio, with Ted Cruz, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those alleged front runners had shown their willingness to carry this Koch agenda, right? The changes to Social Security and Medicare, the attacks on public education, the denial of climate science, the unwillingness to act on it, all the rest. Donald Trump, I actually have a pent-up op-ed that I need to write about this because we've forgotten this whole story, but that was the context in which Donald Trump actually campaigned, except for the racial part, which was horrific, but from the left. He said, I will never cut Social Security or Medicare. I will give you better health care than you have now, and nobody will buy me because I'm so rich. He said all the other candidates were puppets of the Koch network, etc. So for people who would only vote Republican, he became the guy. Now, as I think most people know at this point, Donald Trump doesn't read, Donald Trump doesn't think about policy, Donald Trump doesn't spend a lot of time on much other than monitoring, the image of Donald Trump, right? And so he left everything to others. And he did not have an operation. He had alienated the old kind of establishment Republicans. So who surrounded him? The Koch network. They were fully prepared to do that. And the Kochland book describes this well, too. It's more recent than mine. But At one point, 70% of his top advisors came from deep within the Koch network operations, including Mike Pence, the vice president, Donald McGahn, who was picking all those Supreme Court justices and other justices. You could go on. But so, and also, I mean, this has been the most environmentally hostile and fossil fuel friendly administration in modern American history, right? So particularly on that level and on the courts, this network is getting exactly what it wants from Donald Trump, except they have disagreements over tariffs. That's the only thing they've spoken out about in all of this is the tariffs.
What about migration? Is that more or less?
Migration, yeah, migration is a complicated one because the Kochs are, have this libertarian philosophy and are capitalists of the belief that bring as many workers in as possible because it gives you more to choose from. It'll exert downward pressure on wages if you get enough, and the owners can have whatever they want. So that's a place where there is tension between them and the likes of like Tucker Carlson or something, but they have not been very public about that, and they certainly have not found their voices to condemn some of the most clearly racially charged
Thank you.
things
Before opening it up to Q&A, let me ask you about the international dimension of what you told us. You mentioned the Atlas Network.
Yes.
Can you say some more about that?
Yeah, so this again is something like on Koch My Campus that you can find out about on your own. They're very proud of the work that they do. So if you Google Atlas Network, you can get to the directory that I showed, and you can drill down by country to see who those groups are that are working with them. I will just, again, give you an example. That same wonderful young Greenpeace researcher went to a transnational Greenpeace conference, and they were allowed to have pop-up sessions. So he put up a pop-up session, said, want to know what the Koch network is doing in your country? He had been talking to him about this Atlas network. He said 200 people came from all 5 continents. And the assignment he gave them, he said, get together with people from your country, pull up your laptops and look at your country and report back to us in 15 minutes. He said utter pandemonium in the room. Across the room, everyone was saying, oh my God, those are the groups we're fighting. Those are the groups that are stopping action on the climate. Those are the ones that are attacking climate scientists across the board. So this whole project is, again, this kind of deadly libertarian dogma on social welfare and taxation and other things, but the fossil fuel component is huge. So, for example, Brexit. Now, who would think that this network would have anything to do with Brexit? Except when you realize that the European Union has been crucial in promoting greener policies, in also upholding wage standards, social welfare, public education, etc. So they would like to see the destruction of the European Union, and they'll get it how they can. So their Atlas affiliates in Britain have actually been charged with violating the British Charities Law, which is basically like, our IRS law, for the work they were doing on Brexit, the kind of, illegal, essentially, work they were doing to promote Brexit. Fast forward to Australia, which I'm sure you all know is essentially on fire now. It is such a horrific tragedy. I mean, scientists are estimating that 500 million or maybe up to 1 billion animals have died from these fires. The administration in Australia of Morrison is like-minded to these folks, so it's the same combination of kind of billionaire economic policies, stop action on the climate, and really ugly populism to keep the votes coming. Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, a lot of this research is at a very preliminary stage, and I've been trying to interest other people in doing it. There's journalists scattered around and scholars in different places that I've been in touch with, and these fingerprints are significant. The question is how much, in each case there's of course local, domestic, long-standing histories, of people, elites who didn't like any of these changes or, whatever, didn't want these things to happen. But the Koch network does push out monies, and in fact the Atlas network provides matching grants. So if they can get local people, if the operatives in these countries get local people to say give 100,000 or whatever it is, they'll give 100,000 matching. So it's really quite something. Yeah.
And a counter movement of a same or similar size?
Thank you, because I'm afraid that people are going to start weeping if we don't get to that. Yeah. So I want to underscore what I believe is the single most significant finding of my research. And that is to see these people saying again and again, the architects of this, particularly Buchanan and Koch, that they understand that their ideas are not popular, that they are a permanent minority. So the only way they can win is by changing the rules, right? So that, I think, gives all of us, or should give all of us, tremendous confidence that there is a majority. They're afraid of learning what they're up to and mobilizing to stop this. And in fact, we have been seeing a lot of that. And especially, I mean, the irony of Donald Trump's presidency, too, is how many new people it brought into action. But in the book came out in July of 2017. And since then, I've been speaking pretty much nonstop, like sometimes, several times a week around the country and sometimes in other places, but about this. And everywhere you see the same thing, that groups who have long been working in a kind of siloed way are understanding that we're all in this together, right? And like Annie Leonard at Greenpeace, the head of Greenpeace, says, we've realized we won't ever get a healthy environment until we have a healthy democracy. So they've actually hired a democracy organizer there. At Planned Parenthood, they're saying, we realize we will never be able to protect women's health in this country anymore unless we get a healthy democracy. So they're working on democracy reform. Unions are working on this. Common Cause is working on this. Student groups are working on it. Civil rights groups. I mean, you could just go across the board, I think, all across the country, in fact, across the world, people are realizing that we are facing a deep emergency, all hands on deck moment for democracy, and are pushing to try to reclaim it. So there's in fact a bill in the House that passed unanimously, H.R. 1, that is pro-democracy reform for automatic voter registration, ending the gerrymandering, all these kinds of structural changes we need to stop this thing and prevent it from ever happening again. And then P.S., in good news, if we actually reform democracy so it reflects what the citizenry really wants, then we will get things like a Green New Deal, action on the climate, support for public education to the degree that the people have so much wanted it. All these other things have majority support, but they have been blocked by a system that has been captured by these hostile corporate interests. And by the way, that's not just me saying that. There are many people writing to this effect. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island has a fantastic book called Capture, The Corporate Infiltration of American Democracy. And he writes, as somebody who had been a prosecutor, is now a US Senator, watching this happen. So it is happening. We need to take it seriously. But what I like to say with audiences, because I think it's true, I look out here and I see a wide array of people, all different age levels, I'm sure, coming from different places, interests, passions. If everyone in this audience, or even a portion of you, said, wow, this is serious, I'm gonna do something about this, and started informing their networks, maybe people in your Greek group or your team or your student organization or your faith congregation or other groups you're involved in, and find a way that you can get involved with your particular talents and passions and skills, we could really turn this thing around, and we could renew American democracy in the ways that it's needed for a long time, not just since this effort that I've talked about. We've had chronic problems. Now we have an acute problem, but I believe 100% we have the capacity to fix this if we take it seriously and if we act with mindfulness and care, but
Thank
urgency.
You. I'm glad to notice you have remained optimistic. Let's open it up to questions. Who would like to ask a question? And students are also allowed to ask questions. There's a person there in the middle. Okay. Do we have a microphone to go around?
Try to project.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned potential risk to the Constitution.
Yes.
Would you please instead also, by change, comment on the judiciary to change interpretation?
Yes, so that is so very important, what's happening to the judiciary. And again, what we're seeing now is the fruit of a long-term strategy. I think for a long time, after the Brown case, after Roe, after all these other things that the Supreme Court did that many people supported, people in the liberals and moderates just took it for granted that the courts would kind of always be on the side of justice in the end, and so that we were sort of safe. Well, the political right and the corporate right understood that the courts were a problem too, beginning in the early 1970s. So there was something called the Power Memorandum by someone who was later named to the U.S. Supreme Court, Lewis Powell, the Koch, Buchanan. All of these folks were starting to think about the courts in the early 1970s. And Charles Koch boasts that from very early on, he was providing seed money to major organizations who were doing these changes. So in the 1970s, there was a group called Institute for Justice, the Pacific Legal Foundation, blah, blah, blah. And then ultimately the Federalist Society in the 1980s, which has been the most consequential. And that is a long-term plan to groom people in the legal academy, law professors, to train people who will then become the people like Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch, right, who go on to the highest court and the federal judiciary. Trump, because the Senate under Mitch McConnell prevented President Obama from naming all the judges that he had the right to name, they held back so many that Donald Trump has now appointed, I think it's a quarter to even a third or something of the federal judiciary. It's unbelievable how dramatic it's been. So down to the level of, appeals courts and things like that, but the Supreme Court, of course, being the most significant. There too, I'd say, everywhere there are good people working on this, right? So Common Cause is really excellent on this Constitutional Convention. If you Google Common Cause and Article 5, you can learn more about it and also about their efforts to stop that convention. With the Federalist Society, there's been some great reporting from the Washington Post, in particular, informed by the terrific young researchers of Uncooked My Campus about George Mason Law School and others, and about Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. And again, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse also has a terrific website project called Captured Courts, where you can get more information. But I 100% agree with you. It's going to be an awful thing to realize one day we get up and the courts just rule against everything that we hold dear. I still don't think that's the end of the game, though, as a historian. The courts depend on their legitimacy with the people. This is a fact of legal history. So I think reminding people how these current justices were seated and the backing that they brought and the baggage, that's going to be important to the contest over the legitimacy.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman here.
I hear the ideas that you were talking about articulated, and I'd like to just mention two.
Sure.
One, you hear the vice president of the Locke Foundation defending things by saying there is a choice in higher education. Why shouldn't there be choice in lower education, vouchers, and charter? When Senator Berger was first put into office as the President Pro Tem of the Senate, there was an article in the North Carolina Business Journal by a retired newspaperman, and he was quoted as saying, "I was impacted by this Austrian economist, Haig, I believe his name is." He said, beyond a certain point, taxes are robbing people, and that fits with your idea that they are willing to pay taxes for what they want, but for the public good, they're not. You have any comments about those two kinds of things popping up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think many people, perhaps people who've been in the state for longer, I know there's students here who might be coming from other places, but Art Pope, who is a leading person on the political right in North Carolina, a man of some wealth, family wealth and his own, but has invested significantly in state right-wing infrastructure, including the Locke Foundation, now it's called the Pope Center for Higher Education, I believe, Civitas, etc. And so they have been pumping these ideas out. Many people call them the Koch cousin, call Pope the Koch cousin, because he's been working with them since the 1980s, and he's on the board of Americans for Prosperity, their main organizing enterprise. So his organizations absolutely spout this stuff, and he actually funds a position in public choice economics at North Carolina State University, I found. So this stuff is pretty rife. The individual that you mentioned from John Locke too essentially, some scholars looked into this a while ago, and he seems to just pull his figures like out of the sky. You know, he writes these things that sound sort of authoritative, but they're bogus, right? I mean, they're based on research from centers like the ones that I'm talking about that aren't supported anywhere else, that haven't gone through any normal peer review process. So it's a real problem. There have been some people who have worked on this. I think the North Carolina Justice Center and North Carolina Policy Watch are really good sources to keep up on what's going on in the state as well as democracy. North Carolina for things that are happening in terms of voting rights and gerrymandering. But you're absolutely right to connect those because they are very much connected.
Thank you. There was a question here. Yep. Yeah. Can you stand up? Yep. There's a microphone coming.
I'm just wondering if you're seeing any beginning of people who are who see this reality, trying to form the kind of networks and cross-discipline and cross-sector networks that are needed to really fight this effectively. Do you see any sense of that?
Yeah, I think non-right side of the political spectrum has been paralyzed for a long time by a kind of silo vision, right? Like, I work on environmental policy, I work on, teacher rights, I work on reproductive rights, and not communicating between them. And also foundations. There are progressive foundations and funders, on the progressive side of things, but they have often encouraged their grantees to think short-term, to work for short-term gains, usually locally. And while people are getting really good at winning all those short-term gains and changing hearts and minds, the whole system is changing around us. So you point to a key challenge to create better organization and networking among the groups. I can't tell you, I wish I could, that there were some vast, integrated new thing coming together on the progressive side, but I do think that there's much more communication and beginning to be more coordination and daily efforts on a lot of these things, including democracy defense efforts. So that's important. And there are also progressive funders coming together, both nationally and in states like North Carolina, and I'd be happy to share information about that with anyone who's interested. So, as a friend of mine likes to say, it took us a long time to get this week in the battle, right? It's going to take more than a minute to get out. But I think that the wheels are beginning to turn. We need more and more people to be committed. If you can't do the actual work, maybe you can at least write letters to the editor, or make contributions to organizations that you respect. There's much for all of us to do. And in each of the groups we work, I think one thing that we can do is say, hey, do you know about this larger picture, right? About, how can we alert people about this? Are there groups that we could cooperate with who have like missions, that kind of thing, I think is really important.
And the turnout at elections is important as well.
Yes. This, I think we all realize, the elections that we face now are going to be the most decisive for years. And there are many people, not just me, but if we don't have the turnout that we
There was a question here,
in big trouble.
The microphone is coming there.
This is almost a curiosity question, but I think it's substantive as well. Your description of Virginia as a sort of wall-to-wall oligarchy is no doubt apt. And Virginia has a number of public universities. How did it happen to be George Mason?
Oh, thank you for that question, because it's actually really interesting. When Buchanan was brought to the University of Virginia in 1956, it was actually with donor money from the organization that is a precursor to the one that Charles Koch funds on campuses now. And at that point, people like Harry Byrd were dominant in the state of Virginia. So he came in knowing that essentially his bosses would be thrilled with the stuff he was trying to do. Well, lo and behold, when African Americans got the vote, when they had court decisions that stopped the radical gerrymandering of Virginia to overrepresent these rural conservative areas, and Virginia got a more representative government in the late 60s and early 70s, Buchanan's ideas were terrible. They were trying to develop the state. They wanted to invest in education. They wanted to deal with public health. They wanted to get businesses going. He got pushed to the side. He left to UCLA. There's a crazy, wild story there that I tell in the book. Then ended up going to Virginia, what's now Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, and then went to George Mason in 1983. So kind of a long story. And I actually met the person who was he was the executive assistant to the head of George Mason University when Buchanan was hired, essentially because they knew he'd bring big business donations for this struggling university that was trying to make a name for itself. But this guy told me when I got to meet him, he said, I warned him, that guy would be nothing but trouble. Anyway, it's an interesting story, but it's really alarming now because a lot of the problems that we're seeing in Washington have connections to this Mercatus Institute as their think tank at University of Georgia. They've renamed the law school after Antonin Scalia. It's supplying the Trump administration with a lot of these Justice Department people and judges. So yeah, it's an interesting story. I tell it in the book. I probably can't go too into the weeds.
Over there, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a word or two about a connection between the prosperity gospel and the extreme right, evangelical right, the appointment of Paula White, for example, in the White House.
Yeah.
How that relates to some of this.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. I haven't myself done that research, but I've talked to other people who have done some of it. I followed some of the journalist coverage. And here again, Koch and the people he trains are very sophisticated at figuring out, how can we identify the point of interest that lets us walk together, right? And some of these guys are atheists. They used to have a giant picture of Ayn Rand in the Cato Institute, who was contemptuous of people of faith, right? So that's where they started, but they knew they could never get down the field if they didn't get partners, and the most obvious was to fly under the false flag of conservatism, because they're radicals, but to get conservative voters, and particularly religious right voters, who we've seen are extremely loyal and determined. So I don't have the particular research on prosperity gospel. I haven't done that, but I do know that these many of these organizations and centers fund people developing a kind of pro-ultra-capitalist theology, like the prosperity gospel, and they have also worked with, for example, Tim Phillips, who's the head of Americans for Prosperity. I had him on a slide before. He comes out of the religious right, where he worked with Ralph Reed. So at Americans for Prosperity, he can personally do that fusion of bringing the billionaire agenda together with the folks, in the grassroots right. They also work with and fund, what's it called, the Alliance for Defending Freedom, I think, which is the religious right groups who have promoted essentially litigation to call discrimination religious liberty, so the anti-LGBT legislation, attacks on women's reproductive rights. So because they're doing it in the language of liberty now, that lets them walk together. So that's an area that needs much more research, and I had hoped to begin to do it, but I've been doing all this other stuff.
The next book. Tell us about why did Buchanan get the Nobel Prize for Economics?
Oh, I am asked that so much. In fact, a retired state legislator from Maryland just wrote me yesterday. It was like, I couldn't figure this out, at first. I actually have in the footnotes of the book with his Nobel, because I had people reading my work in draft going, how did this guy get a Nobel? What you need to know about the economics Nobels is that they were created separately from the Nobels we all know and love, right? So Alfred Nobel was a great Swedish humanitarian. He created the Nobel Prize in Literature, the Nobel Peace Prize, and so forth. He endowed those. Many years later, after he died in, I forget, it's late 60s, early 70s, the Swedish bank endowed a prize in economics and got the right to use Nobel's name, even though he had nothing to do with it, and they have nothing to do with the other prizes. So when Buchanan got the prize, the person who was presiding over things was a Swedish economist of the political right, who was himself a follower of public choice. So anyway, and there's more to it than that. I mean, he was a significant. I mean, it's kind of frightening that America's one of the most original thinkers about democracy in the second half of the 20th century essentially thought it was a bad idea. Right? or that democracy without these incredible guardrails was a bad idea. So, I mean, he was an original thinker. You know, he did have an impact, but it is important to know that this Nobel is very unlike the other Nobels.
Thank you. This reminds me, we need a Nobel Prize for History, don't we? Clearly. Any more questions? Yes. Yeah, please. No, wasn't there someone?
I think, yeah, over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is a question that kind of relates to the previous question on the religious right, I think. And I'm just curious how, in your research and sort of analysis of this history, you've differentiated between like real connections between ideologies and sort of their coherence, their like logical coherence in this new value system that you're talking about, and those that are sort of coupled for strategic political reasons. And so I think you know, you've mentioned sort of white. I mean, I'm curious. I think like if you have thoughts on the relationship between, for example, the logic of libertarianism and the logic of white supremacy, or you know, xenophobia or things like that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. There is a significant literature, you know, among libertarians over the years, and you know, and these ideas that kind of make sense. You know, who wants to have the government on your back for, you know, lots of different things? You know, young people, like, you know, they maybe want to smoke pot and not get, you know, arrested for it, or, you know, so you can see that there's a kind of appeal that I think is almost part of the American water stream, that we value freedom. But it's important to understand that this current of ideas is kind of much more elaborate than that, and so radically individualist and pro-property rights that it would really undermine society as we know it. And in fact, some smart critics of Buchanan's in the Academy said that when he got the Nobel Prize, as I quote one in particular in the book. So there's the libertarian ideas, which I now think of as deadly dogma for what they will do to people, what they have done in states where these folks have come to power, like Oklahoma and Kansas, where even the Republicans backed up from them, right? And what they will certainly do if they stop action on the climate. So there's the libertarian dogma. Then there's all these other things that it kind of runs with. And so that's what I was saying that I think is important of understanding this kind of underlying connection to social Darwinism. And for people who are historically minded in the room, when I was in Buchanan's personal office, I actually saw William Graham Sumner and Herbert Spencer, the two leading social Darwinists of the late 19th century. He had their books like within arm's reach of his desk. So these are kind of old ideas, and what you see in this libertarian cause over and over again, and in the European versions as much as in the American, is a slippage from this kind of pure economic kind of libertarian thought to what today gets called the alt-right, to these ideas that some people are superior and other people are inferior. So for example, in Charlottesville, and those tiki torch carrying young men, it was stunning how many of them had been libertarians, right, before going off to this stuff. You see this in a lot of places, and you see it in some other places in the US. Now, not everyone goes off that way, but some people find these ideas too arid, and they go off that way. And in fact, the person who invented the phrase white genocide, who was being read by Dylan Roof, the shooter in Charleston in that black church, had gone to Buchanan and his colleague George Tulloch's program at the University of Virginia in the early 1970s, and left when they left, and he went on to help agitate kind of the more violent sections of the new right, and then into this deep kind of alt-right universe. So the irony is these guys have attacked me for saying, you know, that I overstate the Buchanan connection. Actually, there was filth like that I didn't want to put in my book, because it was just, you know, I didn't want to go down into those weeds. But it's a phenomenon. You see it again and again. And if you're thinking about this in your own research terms, feel free to contact me and we can talk some more, because I think this is a story that needs to be told.
Thank you. Yes, here, the gentleman here.
So So yeah, again, thank you so much for coming. And I actually had a history teacher who recommended your book today and gave me a copy. So I saw your name and I had to be here, right?
That's great.
And
But you should come back.
Absolutely. I think looking at your ideas from an academic sense, we can all get behind what you're saying, and you've illustrated your points extremely well. But if you're trying to convince people from the other side who support a lot of these ideas that this agenda has been packaged within, how do you win them over? Because it's very, it's very hard to say that all of their ideas are part of this big plot, and it's this sinister movement, and they're just pawns in the game, and that's not an easy argument to make, and I don't think a lot of people are going to want to hear that necessarily. And ultimately, won't we need a consensus to get something better out of all of this?
Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, I have made a real effort to, for example, speak in so-called red states, to get to parts of the country that might not hear this message. I've gone out to most faith congregations that have invited me. They tend to be more liberal, and also done a lot of radio. And I actually, one of my favorite, I've gotten a lot of letters from the book, but one of my favorite was from somebody who was a farm equipment salesman in Michigan, in rural Michigan, and he said he heard me on this radio show, and he said I'm somebody who you wouldn't think would take your message. He said, I'm a lifelong Republican voter. I'm a veteran of the Marines. An evangelical. He said, but what you were saying touched my soul, and I'm going to read your book. And I don't. You do what you can, and I think this cause benefits when we are against one another, right? When we're yelling and shouting and pointing fingers at one another, we're not looking at the structures that are making that happen. So I think having very patient and open listening conversations with people is really important. On the other hand, I also teach the history of social movements in the US, so I think about action on this that can move forward quickly, and there I think in terms of concentric circles, beginning with people who really get it and getting those people to work in a more integrated way, then trying to reach people who would understand the importance of this if they knew it and get them involved. And so I kind of think that working through those concentric circles in time could change the national conversation enough so that one might reach those folks that you're talking about, because I believe there are good people. I mean, my basic way of dividing up humanity is like people with good hearts and others. Frankly, I think about 90% of people have good hearts, and that you can have a conversation with. So, and that doesn't respect, party, creed, anything else. So I think, I do feel hopeful about people if they are engaged in honest conversation with good information. But it's a challenge given the media landscape, that's been deliberately created, and there's news deserts in rural areas that are now getting like the Sinclair broadcasting, which is paid by driven by these corporate interests. So it's a big organizing project, I guess is what I'd say.
Thank you. Tell us about that constitutional convention you mentioned, which might be coming or might not be coming.
Yeah, so it's really something. This is not the first time, I should say, that the political right has promoted this idea. So they actually got close in the 1980s, and Buchanan was assisting with it then, but they've since revived it. Again, Common Cause has superb information. Also, the National Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has some good stuff on their website. But basically, it's kind of alarming, because if you go to the Constitution, go to Article 5, there really aren't guardrails there. That's the the amendment of the Constitution that deals with amendments, and it provides for two ways of amending the Constitution. The one that we know, that has gone through lots of sunlight, transparency, public discussion. You push through Congress, then it goes out to the states for ratification, plenty of discussion. We've had 27 amendments that way. Most good, some not so good, but that's the process. Then there's this constitutional convention, which has never been tried. So anyway, it's quite a serious thing. But basically, if 28 state legislatures call for a constitutional convention, they have the right to have it, and then the Constitution has no guardrails for what happens there. So, I mean, legal scholars, well-known, established legal scholars and Common Cause and others following this, basically say, like, if they wanted to, they could potentially change the Constitution. They could do a lot of things. Remember, our Constitution was supposed to be a ratification of the Articles of Confederation, right? But instead, they drafted a new Constitution. So it's quite something and deserves attention. And here's an interesting thing, though. Some of the authorizations are older, so the right has been working hard to get reauthorizations. So there's a group called Convention of States. That's the biggest effort. You can go to their website and see how elaborate this is and the support that they have. But then there's also a new effort. I'm forgetting the exact name right now, but its honorary chairman is former Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin. So they're pushing for authorizations that only include a balanced budget amendment. So there's different efforts afloat, but they are working very seriously through the states and with determination. It's not getting a lot of attention.
Thank you very much. Let me see. Yeah, this gentleman. We need also some more ladies and some more students to ask questions, if I may say so.
The 10 years before we moved to North Carolina in 2011, my wife and I worked in the public sector in New Jersey. A lot of the characteristics you described make me remember what Governor Chris Christie is like.
Yes.
Did any of your research show a Koch influence there? And then the second part of my question, could you name 2 or 3 other states that have advanced pretty far along this track in terms of gerrymandering, voter restriction, discrimination against blacks, women, etc.?
Yeah, so Chris Christie, absolutely. Chris Christie was very much connected to this. I actually quote him in the introduction to the work because he was also attacking teachers, if you'll remember, as Scott Walker was taking away collective bargaining rights from public sector workers in Wisconsin. Chris Christie was gratuitously kicking them in the teeth, like saying really, really ugly things about teachers. So he was very much kind of grooming for this, running in those circles, etc. So you're quite right to point to him. Now, Ted Cruz has not been a governor. So wait, I'm thinking the people involved with the presidential stuff. So Wisconsin, under Scott Walker, of course, and Wisconsin is actually the latest state to authorize the Constitutional Convention. Interestingly, in Wisconsin and Michigan, when the state houses changed hands, the Republican majorities there tried to strip the governors, as they did here, of powers that had long been accorded to the governor. So you see that kind of effort too. Oklahoma and Kansas were strongholds of this stuff. Remember, Koch's from Kansas. But there, they drove government so into the ground that the Republican state legislators could no longer face their constituents because the roads were being destroyed, the schools were being destroyed. They said, we've got to raise taxes. This is crazy. So you do see a reaction in many of the places where this has happened. But there are now 30 states which are to a greater or lesser degree controlled by this cause. I think since the 2016 elections, they've lost some of what are called trifectas, where they have both houses of the legislature and the governorship. Interestingly, on the Constitutional Convention, before voters really turned out for those 2018 midterms and turned things around, there were 6 Republican-controlled states that had not yet authorized the Constitutional Convention. So I actually did an op-ed for The Hill after the Trump tax bill, saying watch out, because here was this party that kept talking about the deficit and government spending, and yet they did these tax cuts and the money to the military that totally drove up the deficit unbelievably, and yet nobody said anything. And I kind of raised the question, well, maybe it's because then the Republicans can say, look, we can't control ourselves, right? We need a balanced budget amendment, which is why we need a constitutional convention. So.
Right at the back there.
Like a teach-in or something.
Yeah, suddenly new energy is coming into people.
Okay, hi. I just want to ask, I also agree with you that the Republican Party received some big donors' money, but I also think that Democratic Party also received many
Definitely.
money from big donors. Maybe not a sophisticated network as you mentioned. But as I know, Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden also have very, very good network in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. So I just want to ask, in this situation, what do you think is a possible third way to get along?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you raised that because it is really important and it is true. And again, back to that Sheldon Whitehouse, the corporate, capture of American democracy. He's not saying it's just them. It's the system, right? That the money in politics, and particularly dark money in politics. I heard in the debates the other night that there are two healthcare industry lobbyists for every member of Congress, right? So this is a big problem, and I think the way that we have to get at it is through these structural democracy reforms that are, being promoted by a whole swathe of groups now. And one of the first big things that needs to be addressed is the money in politics. Unfortunately, because of the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court that opened the spigots for this kind of spending, that can only be addressed through a constitutional amendment, but I very much support and there are several organizations now pushing for a constitutional amendment in the regular way against Citizens United to say corporations are not people and they shouldn't be allowed to do this kind of spending. So that's really huge, and thank you. And may I ask, are you originally from Korea?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay, I thought you might be. I'm just excited because my book was translated into Korean and I just got the copies yesterday, and it's really exciting.
You could have checked whether it's right, whether the translation is right. Okay, over there, what's at the back there?
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your speech. And I'd like to ask a question about China. So you mentioned this Koch network is transnational.
Yeah.
You talked about Brexit and Australia. So did this network have any influence in China?
That is such a great question, and I don't actually know the answer to it. So it would be interesting to look at. I know actually when I went to Buchanan's memorial service at George Mason, they didn't really understand they didn't understand then who I was. When I said I wanted to come and visit and use the archives, anyway, someone said, "Oh, why don't you come for the memorial conference?" I was like, okay. But so it was notable that there were many folks from East Asia who I think were probably working with some of these organizations and affiliates. I don't know about China in particular. I know that many of these organizations, for example, went into Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall in a big way to try to shape, what was happening in the former Soviet Union. And I don't know about China, but I'm really interested. So if you find out anything, I'd be thrilled to know.
Thank you very much. There's a question, the man with the cat.
The Koch brothers are obviously quite old.
That's a microphone, please.
Yeah.
The Koch brothers are obviously quite old. Do they have adult children who share their vociferous ideology and their willingness to spend the family's money on those efforts?
Yeah, good question. David Koch actually passed this past August, but Charles was always the chief ideologue and the builder of all of this, and he is in really good health. In fact, I when my publisher, if you see the book, it has like this smoke-filled room, and I was like, oh, come on, that's such a cliche. This guy probably drinks like carrot and wheatgrass juice 6 times a day so he can live forever. But anyway, so Charles is deeply committed. At this point, the operations are so extensive and there's so many people involved in this that it would go on, but they also have children. This family is so dynastic. I've never actually seen this before, but Charles and his wife, Liz Koch, have 2 children. The boy is named after his father, Charles Jr., Chaz, and the girl is named after her mother. Anyway, the girl is a humanist. She's off like with her own little arts publishing company, trying to stay as far away from the family as she can, as near as I can tell. But the son, Charles Jr., is the inheritor of the mantle. Now, I've heard people say who are closer to the family, or kind of know that side of it, including this guy who wrote the book Copeland, that Charles Jr. is nowhere near as smart as his father, so he's not going to be the kind of figure he was. So I expect that when Charles Koch passes, there'll be a kind of a dynastic struggle, about who's going to inherit the mantle and run these seminars. And so that may open up some space and get some people criticizing and such. But at this point, the operations and the donor networks are so self-sustaining and maintaining that it will continue.
Thank you. The lady here at the front.
I have an alternative ending.
Can you just wait for the microphone?
an alternative ending if there is money not spent for climate control, and it may end up in the planet blowing up if with all the fuel and all that stuff.
I quite agree with you. I think we're faced with an incredibly dystopian future if we don't get ahead of this. I actually recently read a work by Michael Clare, whom some of you might know, someone who's written a lot about military and international matters over the years, and his book is called All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon Perspective on Climate Change. And this is fascinating. Again, we have this Republican Party now that is largely captive to the donors, and I can give you a figure on that in a minute, but so the civilian officials are denying climate change, stopping actions, et cetera. The Pentagon doesn't have that liberty because they're supposed to provide for our national security, and that means paying attention to threats in the world. And they are paying serious attention to this, and they have scenario planning. And the book title, All Hell Breaking Loose, is from one of those, where they predict if we don't get ahead of this, we're going to see failing states collapse. You have droughts, you have fires, you have floods. It's almost biblical, right? In the scale of the plagues. But all these things will happen. They will then put pressure on already weak and failing states. So you get chaos, then you will have mass migrations of populations who are essentially climate refugees, and that's some of what we saw from Central America this past summer, and what you can imagine as you look at Australia. And then there was a question earlier about xenophobia and racism. Most of the people who are going to be migrating from these places that are going to be suffering from sea level rise and arid soil, ruined soil and stuff, are going to be black and brown peoples of the former colonies. And if we think we're seeing hideous nativism now, you can imagine where that could go. So I don't like to go that dark, but on my own, I have to. And I think we all kind of have to, and look at Australia and see what's happening there and say, is that the world we want? And if not, we got to get ahead of this thing. And the good news is if we do get ahead of the threats to democracy and reform democracy in deep structural ways to make sure it's really representative and the money comes out, then I think we can do incredible things. And we have a very bright future. But if we don't take this seriously, as you're saying, it could be an alternative ending none of us would want to see.
We have time for two more questions, let's say. There's over there, yeah.
I actually have two questions. One is, I'm from the northwest corner of North Carolina, so we always go to Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia. So how has this impacted the Appalachian Regional Commission and state politics in states like Tennessee and West Virginia?
Really good question. So I've actually spent a fair amount of time in Tennessee. I've actually been adopted by some people who are trying to turn things around, and they're building a great new infrastructure in politics there, training candidates, doing really good work because their state has been so devastated. And for people who were long working there, they were absolutely blindsided in the 2010 midterms when suddenly like $1 million was coming out of nowhere into races that had been a few thousand. There was just money coming in from this Koch network. So they saw it really dramatically up close, and it has been ravaging to their state. I was just in Kentucky, when was that, in November, a similar story there where public policy has just been kind of it's like North Carolina, right, where there's quite radical change that has very devastating impact on the population. Now, fortunately there, the governor who was associated with this, it was so terribly unpopular and insulted so many constituencies that he since lost his job. So there's a little, opening and light there, but it's a multi-state issue. Now, Virginia, I think, is maybe, a hopeful story to end on too, because in Virginia, people have really rallied. And interestingly, it's like the law of unintended consequences with the Trump election, particularly, but not only, women in Virginia really became active and developed all these great, local groups, indivisible groups, other things. And they, in a single cycle, and they have off-year elections there, remember, because it was such an undemocratic state, they closed the gap, and I'm sorry to speak in partisan terms, but it's become a partisan thing because of what's happened to one of our parties. It was, what was it, 64-36 or something, of 100 in the House of Delegates, and in a single cycle, they made it 50-50, and then it was a coin toss for who would run. They just, in the most recent elections, got a big new majority, and that's why you see a lot of change agenda going on there. But it's like, everywhere where people get serious and put, nose to the grindstone, knock on the doors, make the calls, meet with people, these things can be turned around and good things can happen. But if we don't, we end up like Kansas, Oklahoma, or worse.
Thank you. One final question, this gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you again. This is marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like your assessment, just briefly, obviously, we have time for a brief assessment of the countervailing side to the optimism that if we got organized, if we just get together. I'm a long-time organizer. I believe in that. I work for that. But on the other hand, you spoke in 2017, the very day that you were nominated for the National Book Award that year at Farrington Village. And you ended the talk the same way, with the same nice, optimistic thing that saved all of us that day. But saving the future, of course, is what we're after. And one of the things I'm concerned about is, you also spoke that day and here about the ethics of this movement side, this ideology side, which I don't think are ethical at all, but they are ethics of some sort. And you said you were chilled by pulling a drawer open and reading an email message that Buchanan had written to Koch, or I'm not sure who else.
One of his students had written, I know what you're talking about.
And I think your term at that point was something that was so bone-chilling because they agreed.
Some worthless parasite.
They must
the government
lie.
wouldn't do something because some worthless parasite would object.
Nobody will believe if they tell the real story their way. Nobody will believe, but lie. And I'm wondering, given this optimism, with all of the money and the sources they have, the fact that they'd all spend the other sides, if you will, and the disarray and the fracturing of information in this technology now that we have, they're going to win the technological side of this. And I think that's the other side. What's your assessment of that?
You mean when you're talking about social media and things like that, or?
I mean, they got the word out, and there are lots of people who really aren't very good at figuring out that they're being led down the wrong path.
Thank you. Maybe we can combine that with a final question to you to end the evening. What is your prediction? So will the Koch network go stronger and stronger, or will it all disintegrate and collapse around their ears? What is your prediction? And the combination
well,
with
first of all, I'm a historian, so I'm leery of predictions. I certainly don't think it will collapse. I hope it won't keep as strong. But your point is very well taken, and I will be honest with you and say I have some very dark moments in studying this. I mean, I have a very dark moment watching that coverage of Australia. I won't even say some of the things that made me sleepless that I heard because I've told others and now they're sleepless. So I won't. But, and you're right that I want to say two things. I'm not optimistic. I'm not. But I have hope. And I think there's a really significant difference. I think they've got this thing pretty stacked against us. If you remember the old doomsday clock, the nuclear clock in the Cold War, the atomic scientists had 7 minutes to midnight, they said at one point. I think we're about 10 or 11 minutes to midnight maybe on democracy. I think it's really close. So you're right. It is really something to see what they have. On the other hand, I also keep in mind that they are afraid of the majority. And I see more and more people understanding that something is deeply wrong and trying to figure out how to make it right. And another thing I hold on to is something I have. It's a great resource as somebody who studies and teaches the history of social movements in my class this semester. Next week, we're going to be looking at the Abolition Movement. We think we have problems now in America. We think it's hard for our side. Think about enslaved Africans in this country in the 1820s and 30s. Every single major institution of the society upheld slavery. The universities, the courts, the newspapers, everything you could think of said this is legitimate. It was enslaved people who knew they were people, not property, who managed to flee, who created this sense that something could be done, and then these crazy, good-hearted Christians, right, from the Quakers and people coming out of the revivals of that day who said, this is blasphemy. Slavery is a sin. You know, we have to stop this. That kind of bacillite, like, ended up changing the whole society and the public conversation, right? In ways that we can't anticipate how this is going to go. But one thing we do know is if we don't act, we will surely lose. And then we will get that ugly scenario. That's guaranteed. If we don't act, I don't see anything stopping that. But if we do act, we have a chance. And I think we have a significant chance because we have so many more resources than the people who started that abolition movement did, right? I mean, tons of people educate. Can I just end on one thing, a humorous note? Culture. The artists, the musicians, the filmmakers, the poets, the writers on the progressive side. Do you know who the current president has had to the White House for, like, culture night? Ted Nugent. Really? Like, think of all the resources we have. So here's how I'll end this. And again, not foolish optimism, because I don't think it's justified, but hope, a sliver of hope that we can get this right. And here I'll end with something you wouldn't expect. I happened to hear a Freakonomics radio show as I was speaking in West Virginia. It was the only thing that was coming in, so I thought, okay, I'll listen to it. It was actually really interesting research. They were reporting on research that found that, at least in America, I don't know about other places, but they found that across every demographic that matters, people tend to overestimate their headwinds, right? Rich, poor, black, white, male, female, north, south, etc. We all tend to overestimate the obstacles, the hurdles, the difficulties we're facing, and systematically underestimate our tailwinds, the things that are the wind under our wings that enable us to meet those, whether it's family, community, education, church, culture, all those things. So I think if each one of us, again, started doing a kind of inventory to say, hey, what are my headwinds? What can I bring to bear on this situation? I really do believe that we could see the kind of transformation that we so desperately need. So thank you.
On this semi-optimistic note, thank you very much.